And the regular Sunday afternoon address of Father Charles E. Coughlin from Royal Oak, Michigan.
Father Coughlin is preparing to address you on two very important points. The first deals with bond inflation, and the second is concerned with the neutrality bill. During the next 3 minutes, while the Little Flower choristers with Mr. Guthrell at the organ sing for us the Crucifix, kindly telephone some friend or family to tune to this program. The information contained therein is of vital importance for our peace and our prosperity. Ladies and gentlemen, copies of the address to which you are about to listen will be available to every person in this audience. Your copy can be secured by writing to Father Coughlin directly at Royal Oak, Michigan. Moreover, next week's Social Justice magazine will amplify the remarks which are about to be made this afternoon, giving detailed information on the Neutrality Act, which will either be rejected in full by the 1st of May or rewritten in such a manner as to keep us out of foreign entanglements. It is my pleasure to present to you Father Coughlin in his address entitled Bonds and Neutrality.
Good afternoon, my friends. Today I plan to address you on two closely related current topics. The first part of this discourse will deal with the threatening and possible financial crisis being brought about as a result of our institutions being overloaded with tax-exempt, interest-bearing, non-negotiable bonds. The second part will concern itself with the Neutrality Act, which expires on May the 1st of this year, and therefore which should command the attention of all persons who are intelligently desirous of having a second Neutrality Act written, which will be efficacious in keeping us free from foreign entanglements. Both of these subjects are definitely related to social justice. The first, insofar as we are anxious to attain prosperity, and the second, insofar as we are anxious to settle upon a program of peace. As for the first, the financial crisis threatening us as a result of our countries having been overloaded with debt bonds, let us dwell upon the following considerations. In our laudable effort to institute social reform, we have courted financial disaster. It is true that the Wagner Labor Act assured the right of labor to organize, but has not contributed much to establishing an actual, living annual wage. It is true that the Social Security Act gave expression to the theory of security, but it has not progressed beyond the theoretic stage. It is likewise true that the Gold Act, the creation of the Stabilization Fund, and other financial bills transferred many monetary powers and activities from Wall Street, New York, to Pennsylvania Avenue, Washington. But the transfer in practice has not benefited the nation. All in all, an ever-increasing national debt, now approximating $45 billion, obstructs our progress and nullifies our social reforms. Not disparaging the good intents of those responsible for creating this debt, I cannot help but compare their efforts in my own mind to the royal edict issued centuries ago by a certain king named Canute. Tradition tells us that this monarch, desirous of proving his might to his subjects, determined to do something about the problem of soil erosion. Instead of building a practical seawall to prevent the waves washing away the acres of England, he issued an edict forbidding the waters to trespass beyond certain limits, which he marked on the sands with his royal scepter. His legislation and his intent were perfect. Nevertheless, the method employed by King Canute was inefficient. And so with America. While humane legislation was written upon our statute books to repel the advances of the waves of depression, it will always be remembered as a praiseworthy attitude on the part of government. Nevertheless, many of us are constrained to contend that its method proved most inefficient. The man in the street probably doubts the soundness of these statements. Likely, he is more interested in a glamorous King Canute standing on the shores of time and fulminating against the angry waves of capitalism more than he is in the persistent rise of the tide of depression and the continuous wash of the waves of disaster against the shores of our prosperity. What are 45 or 50 billion dollars of debt to the ordinary factory worker or home renter? Must not this fabulous amount be absorbed in taxation by the rich and by the property owners, asks he? Wherefore more power to the government, thinks he, when the government reaches into the treasuries of corporations, of homeowners, and of farmers to liquidate these borrowings. Unfortunately, the man in the street forgets that it is he, the consumer, who always pays. He forgets that taxation is always added to the cost price he surrenders for his bread, his cigarettes, and his gasoline. He forgets that with every new $1 billion of debt money that is borrowed by the federal government, there is a new dime added to the cost of his groceries. He forgets that for every new $1 billion which Congress appropriates for federal expenses, there is $1 billion of purchasing power kept from the pocketbooks of the citizens. And finally, he forgets that when this occurs, the factory owner will not manufacture goods and will not require the services of the man in the street to produce them. I appreciate that part of our taxation money goes into the construction of public works. But I also know that a great deal of the $45 billion was wasted on relief that did not relieve. When will the man in the street remember that it is he who pays and pays and pays? I recognize that these are not pleasant things to obtrude upon the ears of this audience. Nevertheless, it is a plain fact that if this nation did not have to support $45 billion of debt represented in tax-exempt, interest-bearing, non-negotiable bonds, it would have $45 billion to utilize in production, $45 billion to be spent in manufacturing motor cars, clothing, and building construction, $45 billion of wealth money to speed up the wheels of production and consumption instead of $45 billion of debts to impede the activity of our economic body. Someday, the man in the street will begin to appreciate the difference between theory and fact, between social reform and economic reform, between legislation which does not produce salutary effects and legislation which does produce salutary effects. When he comes to that realization, he will discover that moving the control of debt money from Wall Street to Pennsylvania Avenue contributes no benefit to the welfare of America, even though this moving was accompanied by the fanfare of social reform. Someday he will recognize that every dollar of taxable debt created by the government under the present system of bond issues is a dollar, the major portion of which does not get into the national pay envelope. In 1929, America suffered from a financial crash. Those were the days when Wall Street controlled the finances of the nation. Those were the days when billions of credit or debt dollars, not actual dollars, were loaned by private institutions to states, municipalities, corporations, and individuals. The year 1929 saw the stock market soar to its zenith. To all keen analysts, it was obvious what would happen. They knew that Wall Street and its affiliates, which had loaned 20 and 30 times more credit money than was represented by actual assets, was operating on an unsound basis, and so did the lenders themselves. Consequently, when these inflated loans were recalled, the borrowers found themselves unable to meet the demands of the lenders. Then the market crashed, and the private banks throughout the nation, which had used depositors' money to purchase stocks and real estate, they failed because when they attempted to sell their holdings, they were fortunate to trade them for 10 cents on the dollar. That was 1929, notable for its bank failures and its stock market crash. 10 years has made a difference in our lives. Since then, legislation has been passed by which the federal government protects bank deposits. The Security Exchange Commission has controlled to a certain degree the abnormal price advances on the stock market. Nevertheless, a more serious financial danger looms upon the economic horizon in America. The man in the street probably is not aware of it, any more than the man in the street was conscious of what was about to happen in 1929. If he were aware, he would not be the man in the street. What is this new financial danger that is threatening us? Briefly, it is related to a depreciation of government bonds. It is related to the imponderable burden of $45 billion of national debt which we owe. It is related to the $45 billion worth of tax-exempt, interest-bearing, non-negotiable bonds which individuals, banks, and particularly insurance companies have purchased. For the past 6 years, financial institutions and insurance companies have been investing their money in the purchase of these bonds. Now their portfolios are so heavily loaded with these investments that they cannot afford not to buy more bonds. Consequently, when a new issue of $5 billion of government bonds is offered for sale by the Treasury Department, the present bondholders are almost compelled to buy them in order to protect the value of the bonds which they already hold. Capital is actually forced today to invest in debt instead of production. Thus, a serious condition has arisen. If the present bonds had been successful in breaking the back of the Depression, in getting 10 million men back to work, in taking 21 million men and women off the dole, there would not be a serious reason to complain today. But because this method of issuing more bonds has not alleviated our national distress, it is evident that this practice of issuing governmental bonds and inflation must be abandoned. The insurance corporations and capital in general cannot go on forever buying bonds and investing in debt which does not relieve the situation. 6 years has proven that point, that this policy is about to breed a worse disaster than we experienced in 1929 if it is continued. Thus, if the man in the street is intelligent, he will begin to appreciate that the problem of decent wages, of employment, and of security cannot be settled by mere social reforms. Deeper and wider than any social reform is a necessary financial reform for the salvation of both capital and labor, so that men can get back to work at a profit for themselves and their families. Let the man in the street ask himself, what have these borrowed billions of tax-exempt, interest-bearing, non-negotiable billions of bonds really accomplished? They have not hired the 10 million unemployed. They have not guaranteed a profit for the farmer. They have not multiplied private ownership. They have not put more money into the annual pay envelope of the employed. They have not abolished want in the midst of plenty. They have not spread contentment over the face of the earth. On the contrary, they have increased the cost of living. They have multiplied taxation. They have tended to breed socialism and radicalism. They have jeopardized the very existence of our national solvency. They have cast men on the breadline They have threatened not only the existence of our insurance corporations, but of the billions of dollars which millions of citizens invested in these organizations. They have decreased the number of bank depositors, and finally they have increased the problem of insecurity. All these are not pleasant things to speak about. Nevertheless, I venture to fix our common attention upon these national facts, to suggest that this federal government bond inflation must not proceed any further without jeopardizing the existence of our form of government and the existence of our national institutions and insurance corporations. Every sane citizen is concerned with the safety of the honest investments of his fellow citizens. Every sane citizen is anxious to see the constant operation of factories, the payment of living annual wages to labor, and the continuation of insurance companies in which 30 million Americans have invested their earnings. But prosperity cannot be produced by taxing the capitalists and the workers out of existence to support the non-workers and the unfortunate men and women who are forced to seek their livelihood on the dole. Prosperity cannot be had as long as capital continues to invest in debt, and as long as capital refrains from investing in production. Every time $1 billion worth of bonds is purchased, it's $1 billion that does not get into industry, that does not employ men in factories, that does not feed children, that does not enter into pay envelopes. Thus, it is suggested that our federal financiers abandon the program of issuing these tax-exempt, interest-bearing, non-negotiable government bonds, which are penalizing our gainfully employed citizens, which are threatening our industrialists and insurance corporations, and which are withdrawing billions of dollars from the channel of production, from pay envelopes, and from purchasing power. 6 years of the experiment associated with attempting to borrow ourselves out of debt by adding new debts, that's had its day. A continuation of this policy will bankrupt America economically and politically. Sooner or later, and perhaps sooner than the man in the street suspects, he's always the last to learn this. Sooner or later it will bring about an inevitable collapse of what remains of Americanism, when great groups of people begin to blame our ills not upon the financial theories operated by government, but upon government itself, upon representative government, if you please. I repeat what I said several Sundays ago. Namely, I fear an army of 10 million unemployed, 21 million dolesters, and 13 million exploited taxpayers more than I do the combined armies of Europe and Asia. An army that, instead of diminishing year by year, has been increasing not only in numbers, but in resentment. Let us be honest, my friends, in our attitude towards government. Let us rejoice in the fine social pronouncements which it made during the past 6 years, even though we are sorely disappointed because its financial activities have proven a failure. But let us recognize that 10 billion more borrowed bond dollars of the same type added to our present national debt will increase our national taxation by almost 20%. It will force our insurance corporations and financial institutions either to buy these $10 billion of bonds or to suffer a depreciation in the value of bonds they already hold, and that means failure. It will withhold $10 billion from industry where men earn their livelihood. It will increase the army of unemployed and decrease the purchasing power of the nation. Therefore, let us encourage our representatives and senators and executives to act promptly and courageously in removing this menace from our midst. There's nothing to be gained either by industry, labor, agriculture, education, or religion manifesting a hostile spirit towards government if we criticize some of government's methods. It is a kindly criticism, spoken not against men, but against policies, with the hope that our executive and congressmen will be encouraged to abandon the hand shovel system of digging a Panama Canal and of adopting the steam shovel system of plenty for all. With the solidified backing of this nation, and especially with support coming from you and from the man in the street, possibly our government can be persuaded at this late hour to use the billions of dollars of gold buried at Fort Knox. Possibly instead of issuing interest-bearing, tax-exempt, and non-negotiable bonds for sale, the government will decide to issue negotiable, non-interest-bearing bonds for salaries to all public servants, and thereby stimulate the purchasing power of the nation without adding to taxation and without forcing capital, as represented by insurance companies and banks, to invest money in debt. At least a sufficient amount of this kind of money, of which I've spoken, can be created to restore the necessary purchasing power, which will not only remove the danger of a bond collapse, but which will enable our factories to reopen, our idle to be employed, and our national solvency to be guaranteed. My fellow citizens, we must get back to work in private industry. We can't go on working for the government. Prosperity only comes when industry is active, when the laboring men are paid honest living wages, and when taxation is reduced to a minimum. Prosperity only comes when capital invests in labor, and when labor invests in capital. Further details on this subject will appear in Social Justice magazine. As logical as this proposal appears, namely, our government's utilizing the gold against which to issue negotiable bonds to pass out in salaries to our government employees, I am of the opinion that it will not be entertained too quickly. Preferred to it, I am afraid that we will pass some kind of a Neutrality Act which will permit us to open our factories, to produce munitions and shells and airplanes and cannons, as we enter into the blood business, and from the blood business gain a semblance of prosperity. Therefore, the second part of this afternoon's address concerns itself with the Neutrality Act, which expires on May the 1st of this year. In these days, when there is a possibility of another world war, there is a plenitude of evidence pointing towards our being entangled in it. To many persons, this evidence is not manifest because warmongers are most careful not to disclose their plans. 25 years ago, under the pretext of saving democracy, a war was plotted and planned in secret. We have every reason to suspect that the leopard does not change his spots, that another world war is being plotted and planned with the same secrecy as heretofore. Plotted indirectly, if you will, by certain internationalist financiers and politicians who are planning, even in the face of impending financial disaster, to speed up American employment by manufacturing arms and munitions for foreigners, as Europe prepares to enter a war of extinction unto death. And in this plan, political party lines mean nothing. Prominent public personages of both parties are busy campaigning for a Neutrality Act, which, if it is successfully supported, will certainly lead America into war. Permit me to outline the elements which, to my mind, should find expression in a safe Neutrality Act. Elements, if you agree with them, should bestir you today to go into action. American, Christian, democratic action, to encourage our congressmen to support a real George Washington American Neutrality Act of no foreign entanglements. Wars are no longer declared. The 20th century fashion has been streamlined to fit the style of modern internationalism, which has outlawed the declaration of wars. Foreigners are not the only ones who adopted this new style. According to Senator Shipstead, we Americans have fought 6 undeclared wars. He informs us that we made war on Mexico in 1916 and captured Veracruz without any declaration of hostilities by Congress. That we made war on Russia in 1918, after the World War, without even a proclamation of hostilities by the President. That together with the British Navy, we bombarded Nanking in 1926. And that at other dates, we took over Haiti, Nicaragua, and the Dominican Republic without the benefit of declaration of war by Congress. Now that declared wars are out of fashion for both foreigners and Americans, we should be concerned with the passage of a neutrality bill which will take that fact into consideration. Second, and of more importance, we should be interested in the writing of a neutrality bill which will outlaw the spread of propaganda in our nation. Propaganda designed to condition our people for entrance into an undeclared or declared war. And third, We need a reaffirmation of George Washington's policy of no foreign entanglements in the preamble of our Neutrality Act. This means that we are entitled to an expression on the part of this administration and of all future administrations of the adopted foreign policies which will prevent agencies of government, such as the Treasury Department or the Department of Commerce, from entering into certain trade alliances, financial alliances, and other alliances, which little by little and step by step lead to hostilities with foreign nations. And fourth, secret agreements, if not treaties, must be taken into consideration by our new Neutrality Act. For it has happened in the past, and it can happen in the future, that such secret agreements impose obligations upon Congress which do not permit Congress in a given crisis any other alternative but to enter into a war. It's true that Congress declares war, but if secret treaties and agreements and alliances pre-exist the crisis, Congress can do nothing else but declare war. On these points I will touch in the following minutes at my disposal. A neutrality bill which does not penalize propaganda is useless because it merely concerns itself with the actual engaging in war and does not anticipate the series of events which lead to war. Wars are foisted upon us by warmongers who operate like thieves in the night. It was their propaganda which led us to the slaughter more than 20 years ago. It is this same propaganda with which we are vitally concerned in our neutrality bill today. To bear out this point and prove it, I refer you to an article written in Harper's Magazine in 1918 by Sir Gilbert Parker, the Chief of Staff of British propagandists. It was his job, so he reveals, to condition our president, our congressmen, and our people into financing and fighting the world war in behalf of the so-called democracies of Great Britain and France. This English baronet, who represented the British government in propagandizing America, admits that he was responsible for American publicity from the very day war broke out between England and the Central Powers. According to Senator Gerald Nye, who recently condensed Sir Gilbert Parker's article, which appeared originally in Harper's Magazine, there were several methods employed by Sir Gilbert Parker which were efficacious in their results. Recognizing that it is Congress which declares war, but also recognizing that Congress readily succumbs to the mass determination and conditioning of the people, Sir Gilbert adroitly operated on the American people. Oh, he was not concerned with the constitutional right of Congress to declare war. He knew that if he conditioned the people through propaganda, Congress could not help but declare war. That's his own admission. Consider how efficient this propaganda proved to be. Long before we entered into the World War, we were spending $24 million a day to help the Allies defeat the Central Powers. Consider that approximately $15 million a day was going directly to the Allies, represented by loans and by credits for munitions. For years, this practice continued. For years, we kept piling up investments in favor of one of the warring factions. Investments that were directly and immediately related to war. And then, when 1916 and 17 came, it stood to reason that if our nation had invested its money in a foreign nation already engaged in war, then we were rendered susceptible to the persuasion of propagandists to follow through with investments of soldiers. Consequently, the Neutrality Act, which expires on May the 1st, should not be abandoned, but should be rewritten to take this fact into consideration, so that at some future date another Sir Gilbert Parker will not be permitted to conduct his operations within our shores. Relative to secret commitments, promises, and obligations originating from executives in the State Department or the Treasury Department, and not from Congress, let us be intelligent enough to recognize that no government official is childish enough to tell the American public the real truth of foreign relations. If some citizen directly or indirectly makes the accusation that secret treaties or obligations have been entered into, it's the practice of government officials vehemently to deny the veracity of such charges. That has been the custom in the past. It will be the custom in the future. And to exemplify this, momentarily, let us turn our attention to Great Britain and learn from a concrete example how this operates. 28 years ago, in 1911, March 8th, in the House of Commons, I quote Senator Nye, Mr. McKinnon Wood, the Under-Secretary for British Foreign Affairs, absolutely denied any secret treaty existed between England and France. On November 27, 1911, Sir Edward Grey, a former cabinet officer, said there was no secret articles of agreement in 1904 and at no other secret date. He denied emphatically that France and England had any secret engagements whatsoever. As late as 1913, Lord Hugh Cecil charged in the House of Commons that there was a general belief of a secret treaties existing between France and England. But Mr. Asquith, the former Prime Minister, said that this was not true. His direct words were these, quotations, "If war arises between European powers, there are no unpublished agreements which will restrict or hamper the freedom of the government or parliament to decide whether or not Great Britain should participate in a war," unquote the Prime Minister. On August 3rd, 1914, the very day war broke out, Sir Edward Grey denied that there was a secret treaty or any treaty existing between England and France. But then behold what happened 3 days later. In the House of Lords, Lord Lansdowne admitted that there were treaties not signed. That was the first admission which came like a lightning flash upon the disillusioned British people. Then followed a veritable rain of admissions, of disclosures. The diplomatic lie was out of the bag, and on August 8, 1918, Lloyd George stated in the House of Commons, quotations, "We had a compact with France that if she were wantonly attacked, the United Kingdom would go to her support." And the former Premier, Mr. Bonar Law, also stated in that same year that secret treaties had existed between England and France. And on February 8, 1922, Mr. Austin Chamberlain made the same admission. I cite these things, my friends, to show you that secret diplomatic relations to bind one country to another do exist, and that officials of government are in the habit of denying their existence. Therefore, in the Neutrality Act, which expires on May the 1st, there should be incorporated a clause to the effect that no secret treaty or obligation or promise made by the President, by the Secretary of State, by the military staff, or by any other official, save Congress, has binding power, because such secret obligations unconstitutionally force Congress to a commitment which Congress oftentimes is not free to disregard. Senator Gerald Nye said on the Senate floor on March the 3rd, quotations, "The key to our present situation, in my humble opinion, is the Stabilization Fund, which for over 5 years has linked our Treasury Department with those of Great Britain and France. From that financial link, there has grown up a relationship as secret, as implied, as confidential, as to require no more treaties to sanction it than England and France had in 1911, 12, and 13, when the statesmen of England denied before Parliament and the Cabinet that any alliances existed. Out of these secret understandings, under which the French franc is supported on the very eve of Hitler's negotiations with Mussolini," continues Senator Nye, "the so-called democracies of England and France are wedded to our American Treasury to the point where the Treasury supersedes the Secretary of State in the diplomatic negotiations as among sovereign powers." My friends, if the Neutrality Act wishes to build up a barricade which will prevent our entrance into a foreign war, it should take into consideration this infamous Stabilization Fund, which, without benefit of publicized treaty, without benefit of open treaties openly arrived at, has linked our destinies to the empires of Great Britain and France, and thereby has committed us, indirectly at least, to a possible foreign entanglement. By all means, let us have a Neutrality Act which not only takes into consideration the last step of declaring war, but which will take into consideration the first steps which lead to war, namely propaganda emanating from foreigners, secret diplomatic commitments originating from ambassadors and executives of government who are not congressmen, financial policies such as the Stabilization Fund, and their secret negotiation with foreign powers for selling arms and munitions to those nations engaged in war. From available sources, we now know how our nation was conditioned to enter the last World War. We who boast of the freedom of the American press should take preventative measures in our Neutrality Act, lest this freedom of the press be so abused that it degenerates into a gullible press. On this point, and in reference to the Neutrality Act, let me remark that previous to 1918, Lord Northcliffe, one of the most powerful publishers in Great Britain, established a mission in New York. This propaganda mission was successful in establishing a supply of favorable reports to the American newspapers. It was a mission, according to Mr. Frank Anstey, a member of the Australian Press Commission on the Western Front, that had 4,500 agents in the United States, 4,500 newspaper men, publicists, warmongers, running up and down and across America and finding expression for their propaganda in the columns of our daily papers to work upon the gullibility of our American editors and through them upon the passions of our American public. How far can the Neutrality Act encompass this situation so as to prevent its recurrence in days to come? Propaganda in America, which leads us to war, should find some clause in the Neutrality Act and should be punished as a felony. More than 20 years ago, Great Britain and France won the war, not so much by bullets and machine guns as it did by the silver-tongued words and chastely written paragraphs of its generals in the fields of literature, journalism, and publicity. So important was this department for England that Colonel Hammersley, a member of the British Parliament, said on the floor November 7, 1918, quotations, "To my mind, an end is put to the Ministry of Information, and if activities are withdrawn from America, it will not be short of a calamity to this country," unquote the British Member of Parliament. This gentleman spoke the truth. He admitted the true press agent activities in America, activities that drained us of our wealth and of the flower of our youth, activities which helped to spread the lie that we were fighting a war to make the world safe for democracy. The Allies would not have won. Imperialism would not have conquered. International financialism would not have been sustained except through the agency of propagandists who worked in America. My friends, we are keenly interested in the preservation of peace and in the attaining of prosperity. Therefore, I call upon you to tell you that this is the opportune time for action. Action before May the 1st, 1939. By that date, a new Neutrality Act will have been written. Perhaps it will be written to give the President full power to declare war. Perhaps it will be written to give us the benedictions of new propagandists in our nation. Perhaps it will only be a Neutrality Act in name. Perhaps it will be the first chapter of our entrance into the last chapter of our existence. From this day forward, then, I ask you to interest yourselves in suggesting to your congressman your personal thoughts on this subject. Let us encourage these congressmen to pass a Neutrality Act that will stifle propaganda. A Neutrality Act that will prevent executives outside Congress making commitments, financial or otherwise, to any foreign power. We want a Neutrality Act because we want peace. We want a Neutrality Act that will prevent America from engaging in the blood business. We want a Neutrality Act which will keep America from financing directly or indirectly any belligerent nation that engages either in a declared or undeclared war. We want a Neutrality Act which will limit the use of our soldiers and sailors, our munitions and arms and money to the defense of America inside American territory and inside American waters. It's not our business to become the policeman of the world. we have plenty at home with which to engage our attention. At the same time, my friends, encourage our congressmen to discontinue the issuance of tax-exempt, interest-bearing, non-negotiable bonds, which experience has proven have not been efficacious in solving the problems of unemployment, of decent wages, and of depression. Encourage your congressmen to alleviate the tax burden, to protect industry and agriculture, which are the sources of our wealth, and also to protect the investments which millions of our people have made in insurance corporations. This financial reform is directly related to the passage of a genuine Neutrality Act. If we have no financial reform, rest assured we'll go into the blood business to protect the tax-exempt, non-negotiable, interest-bearing bonds, and thus permit the foreign nations to invest in our heavy industry. My friends, let us recognize that the most efficient means to accomplish all this is direct contact by every individual with his senator and his representative. These gentlemen are willing and anxious to abide by the judgment of their constituents. And in conclusion, I want you to know that in the past 5 years, our insurance corporations and financial institutions have invested $17 billion of money entrusted to them by the citizenry of this nation in the purchase of bonds and debt, and have loaned only $1 billion to industry. There's the record, a record which cannot endure. How long can we endure if we continue to invest the wealth of our nation in debt? How long must Congress sustain a financial system which has now reached the point where it forces our insurance corporations to continue investing in these bonds, lest the bonds which they now hold will depreciate and chaos will eventuate? I speak these things to you, not in the spirit of bitterness, but in the spirit of hope. A hope that you will bestir yourselves in your churches, your clubs, your societies, and your homes to strike a blow for Christian American peace abroad and Christian American prosperity at home. My friends, 3 weeks ago today, I made an appeal to the members of this audience for volunteers. I asked for 5,000 responsible persons to undertake to distribute social justice magazines in their own neighborhoods and communities. I am proud to report that 2,500 such persons have manifested their interest in this project. Social Justice magazine carries no advertising, although a plenitude of it is available. But lest it should be suspected that this publication, which is printed at one of the largest union shops in the world, is controlled by the advertising dollar, we gladly forego all such revenue. Social justice is designed to propagate social justice for all. Therefore, this afternoon, I ask all those who are interested, both in the Neutrality Act and also in our financial and economic and social problems, to become interested in distributing social justice magazines, each in his own community, or else directly subscribe here for 1 year at $3. I do not wish to appear to be commercial, But both this program, as well as Social Justice Magazine, are yours. They are not mine. They are yours, and I'm your spokesman, telling you the truth as I see it and as I know it. May I now take this opportunity to inform you that a copy of this afternoon's address will be given to you gratis if you write to me this week. Good afternoon, and God bless you.
Only by vitally interesting yourselves in your congressman will you succeed in having written a neutrality bill which will guarantee our future peace. Ponder upon Father Coughlin's advice today. Organize among your friends, in your clubs and societies, to appeal to Congress to pass a neutrality bill that will be a neutrality bill. Once more, may I remind you that a copy of this afternoon's address is yours for the asking. Address your letter to Reverend Charles E. Coughlin at Royal Oak, Michigan. Your announcer is Franklin Mitchell.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've presented the regular Sunday afternoon address of Father Charles E. Coughlin from Royal Oak, Michigan. The thoughts and opinions contained in this address were entirely those of the speaker and in no way reflect the policies of this station. Your dial is set at 1250 kilocycles.
WHBI, Hoyt Brothers Incorporated, Newark, New Jersey.